So the purpose of this video is to really tee up some of the core concepts that I believe is the underpinning of genuine systems change, and to try and preempt some of the questions that people who are not familiar with these terms might have. So, for instance, some of the more meta issues that we'll be discussing around the carbon cycle and some of the processes and mechanisms by which genuine regenerative culture could emerge, such as seaweed farming and topsoil regeneration. Some of these things may seem incredibly distant for many of us, especially living in restricted urban environments. But I do believe it's really important for us to have a basic understanding of how important these mechanisms are, so that we can use that information to inform our own more domestic and local action. I'm always very keen on the British comedian Peter Cook's expression, "I've learnt from my mistakes and I'm sure I could repeat them exactly." And I think if we're really genuinely going to start acting and living in a new and different way, then we've got to actually learn to think in a different way and to really, really embody some of these core ecological concepts within our very thinking. Otherwise, we're just destined to keep repeating the same mistakes. So again, on a similar kind of level, some of these things that we'll be talking about and presenting obviously have a much more pertinent application for people living in the countryside, in a rural environment, but some things will also have much more of an application for people living in an urban existence. And so we're trying to cover all bases and really pay a lot of attention to the fact that we are a predominantly urban species. A lot of us have no direct access to the land, and so it creates a feeling of disempowerment, because people can look at some of the things that we're talking about here and go, well, that's all very well, but how can I integrate that in my urban existence in the Northern Hemisphere, for example? However, if we have a core understanding about why topsoil regeneration, for example, is so important, that can give us further motivation to understand why something like a community composting initiative in an urban environment can be so applicable. So I wanted to just tee up there the notion that some of these more meta or macro issues have a pertinent application at the more micro domestic end of the pipe. Similarly, some of the rural initiatives also have an urban application, and we're going to do whatever we can to address both of those. But also, likewise, we really do encourage you all to give us your feedback, to share this as widely as you can with others you think who are resonant with these sort of issues. But please do also tell us what we're getting right, what we're getting wrong, what you'd like to hear more of, what you'd like to hear less of. So we're super keen to hear from you all. Please share, please support us in any way you see fit through the donate page on the website and through Patreon, etc. We would be incredibly grateful. Thank you. The next thing I wanted to talk about was some of the basic terms and the definition of terms. Having been floating around in this kind of area all my adult life, I've seen how a lot of the very progressive thinking and concepts and terms have to some extent been co-opted when they've been drawn into the mainstream. And the terminology around regeneration and words like resilience are becoming incredibly popular buzzwords within the corporate lexicon, the circular economy as well. And people talk about the circular economy light, which is really a further iteration of the sustainability agenda, which I see as more of a sort of gradualist, incrementalist approach rather than a genuine, deep systemic change. So I thought, before we go on this journey, I just wanted to present my own thoughts around what these terms mean when I use these terms, like self-reliance, resilience, and regeneration. And by self-reliance, I suppose I'm really addressing the fact that so much of what used to be part of our own our own possibility in terms of what was within our power to actually affect has gradually over time been drawn away into ever more centralized and distant institutions, systems, etc. And this has accentuated this sense of disempowerment because we've been divorced from our food sources, from our water sources, from our energy sources. All of these things that were to some extent within our control have become increasingly less in our control. And so we're very, very dependent upon very fragile supply lines and very centralized infrastructure. And as something like the COVID crisis has made clear, the fragility of these systems is very problematic. And should supply lines and food security issues start to kick in, I think many of us are starting to realize just how quickly so many of the things we take for granted could suddenly become very, very problematic. And that is why I believe that the real empowerment that many of us seek can really come about by bringing as much of these things, as many of these things back under our control as possible, particularly our essential biological human needs, particularly, say, food, water, energy, but also communications, transport, housing, all of these issues. So when I'm talking about self-reliance within the regeneration program, I'm talking about how, not just as individuals, but also families, communities, businesses, how can we bring back as much control as possible over some of these really important and essential needs. This word resilience is obviously incredibly important, and again you see it cropping up all the time within the mainstream economy and sort of corporate vernacular, etc. But I suppose, again, I'm just talking about the resilience of a family, of a community, of a business to deal with and adapt to rapidly accelerating change. If we do start to see a genuine breakdown of some of these systems, the businesses, the families, the communities that are able to adapt and adjust to those changes will be, by definition, the most resilient. And we'll go on to talk in a little bit about how some of this is supported by sort of core ecological thinking. And finally, this term regeneration, which again has started to crop up in all sorts of different areas, has become a bit of a buzzword. And I really would recommend, for those who haven't seen it, a film called What's Your 2040, which is one of the first documentary filmic visions of what the world could look like in 20 years' time if we made the right decisions now. I think it's an incredibly important film, and one that anybody who's concerned with these issues should watch. I'm not necessarily in 100% agreement with everything in that film, and we'll touch on that later over the coming weeks and months, but I do think it's an incredibly brilliant overall picture of how things could look if we did the right things. And the core element for me, for the regenerative philosophy, in distinction from sustainability was essentially, how do we sustain a broken system or do business a little less badly than we did before? It's not actually doing anything to genuinely systemically transform the system. It's not doing anything to actually reverse and restore the ecological damage that our systems are doing. So although the word regeneration has become very aligned with regenerative agriculture, I believe that it could also be applied to all of these other areas that we're looking at here, such as health, economics, culture, and even consciousness, through all sorts of different mechanisms. The essential criteria, I would say, for a regenerative system, and what the essential criteria for anything that we will be addressing here, is it actually cyclical rather than linear? Is it actually regenerating and contributing to the restoration and regeneration of biological systems, or is it inherently depleting and degenerative, like our extractive linear economy is? And a bit later in this video I might sort of try and illustrate that a bit more deeply with some examples. But that was just a sort of brief summary of a sort of definition of terms. Well, let me try and just apply those three terms, say, to a particular area, such as health. At the moment, we've kind of been inculcated and conditioned into a culture that as soon as there's something wrong with the human biological system, the immediate notion is it can be rectified by the application of a non-biological pharmaceutical drug. We go to a doctor, we get given a pill, we take the pill, we get better. It's a very downstream approach to take. What I'm trying to do here is highlight upstream preventative measures that prevent us going to the doctor in the first place, using proven biological preventative principles to maintain resilience and immunity in the human system so that we abdicate the need for the doctor or pharmaceutical intervention. Similarly, let's look at something like the economic system. At the moment, we have a linear and extractive economic system that has discounted anything to do with the health of society and the environment as being a meaningless externality. So the metric by which everything is assessed is purely quantitative rather than qualitative. And as Edward Aby once said, growth for the sake of growth is the philosophy of the cancer cell. And there was one of the early ecological economists, Herman Daly, I think back in the 1950s, made a very crucial, important distinction, I think, between growth and development, but which our economists to this day seem to have failed to integrate. A system that is growing is just getting bigger. A system that's developing is getting better. Now, all biological systems grow to a certain point, but then that growth stabilizes and they develop. Unrestricted growth is cancer. So essentially, we're still running our economic system on software that was developed for the Industrial Revolution, when there was seen to be infinite resources and infinite labor and the rest of it. And so we created systems then that were pertinent to the time, and we haven't updated them to integrate what we now know about how ecological systems operate. So as ecological economists have shown, there's absolutely no reason why we couldn't maintain the level of prosperity that we have without this reliance on an endless narrative of growth. Because an infinitely growing economy dependent upon finite resources is just logically impossible. It's just not going to happen. And that's why we're sort of running out of road. Now, if you incentivize businesses to regenerate the environment rather than deplete it, I mean, the way everything at the moment is taxed and incentivized is completely back to front, like everything else. So the world's biggest polluters are the most subsidized, instead of the other way around. This is why organic and regenerative agriculture is deemed to be inefficient, because the metric by which it is assessed totally ignores the health of the global ecology, the topsoil, and the human body itself. So if we're actually to recorrect that, we've got to integrate the real cost within the price of what we're charging things. The reason why industrial agriculture is deemed to be efficient is because of the artificially subsidized low costs of fossil fuel and all the fossil fuel inputs. If we actually deconstruct that and look at it in reality, every unit of food calorifically generated by industrial agriculture has required something like 10 units of energy to produce it. So by those metrics, it's woefully inefficient. When in fact, permaculture systems, regenerative agriculture systems, which actually maximize soil health and maximize intercropping and synergistic relationships between plants, produce way more food, way more efficiently, but it's out of step with the metrics of the linear economic system. So we have to actually go through a step change across the board. And until the economic system reflects these new understandings, all of the things we really need to implement within a regenerative society will continue to be deemed to be inefficient. But as soon as they're embedded within the context of the circular economy, they become incredibly efficient. And so this again is one of the sort of mismatches between a genuinely regenerative economy and a linear extractive one. And now I wanted to introduce a few systems thinking concepts and some ecological concepts. And again, for those who are unfamiliar with this, I would highly recommend taking a listen to the audio file of Is the Virus Our Vaccine, the essay I published in May this year, which goes into some of these concepts in a bit more detail. And I'd say that essay either read as a PDF or listened to as an audio file in conjunction with this video, I hope would be a very useful primer for people who are unfamiliar with these concepts before embarking deeper on the regenerative journey. And I suppose there are three or four things that I feel are particularly pertinent here. One is around complexity and diversity. Another is a term called autopoesis, and another is a term called homeostasis. So complexity and diversity, one of the things that we can observe about ecosystems and the way nature operates is that as a system, a complex system increases in complexity and diversity, so does its ability to self-regulate, self-organize, and adapt to changing conditions. Its immunity in its resilience to external factors increases. As soon as that complexity is jeopardized and reversed, the reverse is true, and immunity breaks down, resilience breaks down. And this can be seen at every level of the system, from topsoil to the microbiome of the human gut, through to society at large. And for those who are interested in the whole notion of the collapse of complex societies, there's a fantastic book by a man called Joseph Tainter called The Collapse of Complex Societies. And he shows how one of the real takeaways for me from that book was that one of the indicators of a complex society approaching collapse is a sort of cultural homogenization and an increasing polarization. And I would say it's very obvious that these are two things we can see happening in our world today, increasingly so. So cultural diversity and cultural homogenization, I would say, are very, very crucial areas for us to look at. And since we have this tendency towards this globalized, homogenizing, one-size-fits-all culture, this is actually eroding the resilience within our communities, which we so desperately need to hold on to. So I think complexity and diversity within the ecosystem, within society at large, within the gut flora of our microbiome, at every level, this is absolutely crucial. So thriving, living, organic topsoil, 1 teaspoon of topsoil contains more biota, more microorganisms than all the human beings that ever lived. This is one of these crazy statistics that's hard to sort of get our heads around, and it's one of the insights that's come about in the last 20, 30 years because of advances with electron microscopes, and that is why we now understand soil biology so much better, why we understand the microbiome so much better, why fields like neuroplasticity and epigenetics have started to redefine our understanding about human biology and the rest of it, and why we're sort of we need a step change within our scientific paradigm to actually incorporate that. So this term autopoesis again is an ecological term to point towards that ability for self-organization to arise as an emergent property of the complexity of the system. And one of the areas which I feel has always been very difficult to articulate within this kind of field is this area around new systems of governance and new ideas about how we organize ourselves. And I think it's, in a way, it's the last bit of the jigsaw here. We've got a good understanding about ecological design, regenerative agriculture, preventative upstream healthcare, circular economics, all of these areas. But what's still very hard to define is how we self-organize, how we come together and create these new governance systems. And I think that is because it's still an emergent property that's yet to really kind of be fully fleshed out. But I do believe that the seeds of it are there. And again, like all of these things, if we look to ecosystems, this is where we find the inspiration that we're seeking. And then homeostasis. And homeostasis, often a term that comes aligned with James Lovelock's Gaia theory, that essentially these are the balanced equilibrium conditions that life and complex systems try to maintain, to optimize the conditions for life. And if you look at almost any culture and ancient tradition from around the world, or philosophy, whether it's the yin and the yang of Taoism, the Shiva and Shakti of Hinduism, but also in Western culture, and even in sort of our sort of atomic physics, we have two forces at work at the universe, within the universe, which are sort of the polarized forces, chaos and order, whichever way one wants to look at this. And what life is doing is trying to stabilize those forces in such a way that it maximizes the optimal conditions for life. Now, what the Gaia theory is suggesting is that those homeostatic self-regulating mechanisms have been so interfered with due to the amplified way in which we have interrupted the carbon cycle. So the fossil fuels that we're putting up in the air in the course of a year have taken nature 1 million years to sequester safely into the Earth's crust. So there is something massively out of kilter there, and this is a point that someone like Daniel Schmachtenberger makes very eloquently, is that one of the reasons we've stepped outside of the system and created these waste products is that we, through the amplification of our technologies, stepped outside of the ability for natural biological systems to deal with that evolutionary process. So we filled our air, food and water with synthetic compounds and chemicals that nature simply hasn't had the time to evolve to deal with. Similarly, the speed at which we're taking fossil fuels out of the Earth's crust and putting them into the atmosphere is happening at such a speed that natural geophysical processes cannot cope. So again, within this kind of regenerative model, all of these processes, whether they're ecological design processes or regenerative agriculture processes, the intention is to step back inside the system by eliminating waste at all levels of the system, because we're the only species to have generated waste, and the interruption of the carbon cycle could be seen as a waste problem. The unbelievable number of synthetic toxins and compounds that are now ubiquitous in nature have all just arisen in the last 100 years or so, and natural systems simply cannot cope. So we've got a sort of toxicity problem, but we can detox those things, we can rebuild the topsoil, we can draw carbon back into the ground, we can use ecological design processes to make these closed loop systems. So you create a sort of industrial ecology where the waste product from one business becomes the resource for a separate business. And so there never at any point in the system is anything going to landfill. Now, obviously, there are some industries that simply aren't compatible with that system, with those principles, and really have no place within a genuinely regenerative world, and they really need to be phased out. But there's no reason why those industries, while being phased out, couldn't be transformed through ecological design principles into providing a similar service, but which is compatible with these cyclical processes. So now I also want to just talk a little bit about this shift in scientific worldviews, which I think is so unbelievably pertinent right now. And I would say that some of the extraordinary sweeping policy changes we're seeing around the world are predicated on an institutionalized medical scientific paradigm, which might not necessarily be correct, or really needs to be updated with some of these new understandings that have evolved in the last 30, 40, 50 years. And I tend to use this word scientism now to try and point to the fact that this reductionist, materialist scientific worldview has replaced our religious belief systems as the source of truth, when of course science is only ever the closest approximation to the truth given the current understanding. However, what we now seem to have is a very inculcated scientific paradigm, or scientism, a sort of extremist, fundamentalist, codified science that's based on a particular approach, this reductionist, materialist approach that basically believes that you can understand how all living systems work by reducing them to their smallest particles. And this leads to some very simplistic, naive assumptions, particularly around sort of linear causal and effect, because one has isolated components out of their embedded context of the system and then made a whole load of assessments around that particle in those circumstances, ignoring the fact that that component, when it's embedded within a living system, interacting with all the other parts of the system, might exhibit very, very different characteristics. And I think it was the German polymath and philosopher Goethe who said that science first started to really deviate from its original sort of core essence when it started studying organic living things when they were dead, i.e. taking a cell from a dead body, putting it in a petri dish and running a whole load of tests on it. How a living cell operates in a petri dish removed from the biological living context is obviously very different to a very different way of looking at things. And I think although this scientific worldview isn't entirely wrong, I think often it is actually entirely wrong, but it's also needs to be updated, and we'll go a bit more deeply into that later. But again, I think this sort of linear causal assumptions really lies at the root of some of the wrong approaches we might be taking within human health, within agriculture, with our approach to climate change and the rest of it, because we continue to apply solutions to these complex biological problems from this very sort of linear reductionist perspective. So, for example, geoengineering schemes that suggest we fill the atmosphere with lots of little particles of sulfur dioxide or whatever it may be to counteract global warming is a very linear solution to a very complex biological problem that's probably only going to create further unforeseen consequences further down the line. Whereas if we actually used photosynthesis, the most incredibly efficient natural process to draw carbon out of the air and through plants back into the soil, and some estimates are that we only need to lift the organic soil content of half the world's arable land by something like 0.2% to bring carbon levels back to pre-industrial times. So there are enormous possibilities there. Similarly, seaweed farming, which could in a way be seen as a form of sort of biological geoengineering, massive, but at least it's a biological process, and seaweeds grow something like 30 times faster than any land-based crop. So their ability to not only sequester all of this excess carbon out of the oceans, where so much of it has been stored, and has, it's only really, people have only begun to realise relatively recently just how carbonically acidified the oceans have become, and for how long they've been absorbing all of this excess carbon. And again, we would need to cover something like sort of, I think it's 9 or 10% of the world's oceans with seaweed to bring carbon back to where we want it, which sounds incredibly ambitious. But at the same time, we also rebuild the biodiversity in the oceans. We rebuild fish stocks and feed the world with fish protein. And we also open up incredible economic opportunities, which must make more sense than filling the atmosphere with sulfur dioxide particles or elaborate, very intensive carbon sequestration technologies that are totally unproven. So again, it's a complete sort of systems change in our basic approach to these things. And just following on from that, I thought I would use just a couple of examples which I think serve quite well to illustrate this. And one of the things I always think is very interesting was, I think it was in 1858 when the Houses of Parliament in London were unable to convene because the stench from the sewage in the city was so bad. And when Parliament did come back together, they debated two different approaches to the problem, one of which was based on what big Chinese urban centres had done for millennia, which was really to aggregate all of the human sewage and then take it to the outskirts of the city where it was properly composted, where it was then feeding the market gardens, which then generated the vegetables, which then fed the urban centre. And that's a cyclical system that obviously makes tremendous sense ecologically. The other system was the linear system, which of course was adopted and then was sort of exported around the globe by the British sort of imperialist colonial empire. And essentially it was taking human sewage, mixing it with fresh water and flushing it into watercourses and out to sea. So not only are you depriving the soil of the important organic waste that it needs, you're also then mixing it with often potable fresh water, polluting it and contaminating watercourses further down the line, which can lead to sort of all sorts of further problems in terms of algal blooms and biological oxygen demand and all sorts of knock-on effects to aquatic ecosystems. So I think some of the scientists at the time realised that this was going to be the beginning of a massive problem in terms of depleting the nutrients of the world's soil and hence of our food systems. And so they set to work on the origins of what became the agrochemical industry. And I think Justus Liebig, was one of the first people to start experimenting this in the latter part of the 19th century. So to me, that's a very, very pertinent example of how a very crucial cyclical biological ecological system has been subverted into a linear one and brought all sorts of unforeseen consequences with it. Similarly, when you look at something, a chronic systemic health issue, and I've experienced this myself over the years, having spent a lot of time in Asia and Africa, and having had malaria 3 times and all sorts of problems with parasites, etc. If you try and treat a systemic chronic problem, biological problem, with non-biological means, all it can do is suppress the symptoms. It's simply axiomatically impossible, I believe, to cure a biological problem with non-biological means without creating a systemic side effect. And this is why iatrogenic illness is, some people say it's the second leading killer in the US now. And that is, that's death caused by the side effects of the pharmaceutical drugs that are supposed to be curing you. And that is why the average 60-year-old in the US or something takes over 10 different medications. But most of those medications are just dealing with the side effects of the previous medication. It's just knocking the problem further down the line because it's just suppressing the symptoms and it's not going to the root cause. So, for example, although I had malaria 3 times or something when I was in Africa and I took very strong pharmaceutical drugs that, yes, in theory cured the malaria, but in fact all that they did was force the malaria parasite deeper into my liver or wherever it harbours, so that it continues to flare up later in life. Similarly, when I first got all sorts of problems with my amoebic dysentery and parasite issues when I was in India, when I was 18, and then was given courses and courses and courses of very strong drugs, tetracycline, flagyl, metronidazole, all of these things, which essentially decimated my gut flora. And once it's been decimated like that so conclusively, because this was done over months and months and years even of taking these drugs, and so not only does that reduce your immunity, it can cause depression, but it also just makes it almost impossible to rebuild the diversity and complexity of the gut flora that was originally there. So yes, often these sort of naturopathic approaches to dealing with these sort of issues can take a lot longer, but ultimately the chances that they're going to genuinely heal the system is that much greater, because they are in step with natural, biological, ecological systems. It's not taking an alien synthetic substance to deal with something in a very simplistic way. And this is why the overuse of antibiotics and the rest of it has decimated our gut flora. And I think the collapse of our gut flora and the microbiome is a massive, massive factor within the mental health epidemic. I think there's absolutely no doubt about it. And something like 80% of our immune system health now can be attributed to the complexity and diversity of your gut flora. So again, that's a big area we're going to be looking at on this journey. But I think those are some examples of how this reductionist scientism has given us a very misguided approach to dealing with ecological problems. I also wanted to talk a little bit about what I'm calling the ideological crisis, or the momentum within a confluence of ideologies, which I think can really helpfully explain a lot of the confusion that we find ourselves in. And I think we have a tendency always to ascribe agency or intentional agency to people, to blame somebody or to blame something for being the problem, overlooking the fact that these people might just be the leading protagonists or manifestors of particular ideologies. And we then can also subjectively ascribe our own sort of value judgments to these people or to these institutions, when in fact they might actually genuinely believe that what they're doing is the best thing for humanity. So there's a very interesting 1958 interview with Aldous Huxley by a guy called Mike Wallace, I think, which I would really recommend. You can find easily on YouTube, and he really articulates this absolutely beautifully. So there are three isms or three ideologies that stick out for me as being incredibly pertinent, and they're globalism, technocracy, and transhumanism. Now, globalism is fairly obvious, I guess, but there's been an inherent tendency for at least 100 years now, I would say, within the echelons of power, a quite perfectly obviously natural gravitation towards one globalized economic system, but also one globalized ideology, even one global government. And so people who have really analysed this talk about the League of Nations post the First World War, which wasn't very successful, but subsequently with the so-called Bretton Woods institutions post the Second World War, with the UN, World Bank, IMF, etc. And there has been a sort of increasing momentum within those globalising forces and the creation of these different sort of trade zones, the increasing sort of gravitation towards one world currency potentially. And there's a lot of talk now around the World Economic Forum's Great Reset and all of these agendas. So there is clearly something at work there. And I think it's the confluence of that ideological momentum with this term technocracy and maybe transhumanism, which we'll come to in a second. Now, technocracy is a term that seems to be coming up a lot more in recent months. There's a man called Patrick Wood who's written a couple of very interesting books, and you can see his talks online, who's probably one of the world's sort of leading analysts on this. And he goes back to like the 1920s and 30s and the origins, I think, in Columbia University. And at the beginning of this whole sort of technocratic vision, a very, very overtly stated goal that social engineering was absolutely intrinsic to this process. And like many terms, that has been sort of now over time diluted into something that seems a little more palatable. And but I think the Technocracy Inc., as it was called, had something like 500,000 signed up members by the 1950s. And I suppose one can see how that has now merged within these globalizing influences and the technology that we now have to create the possibility for a one world technocratic system. And I suppose the most important sort of takeaway around technocracy of all for me is that it is essentially an economic system rather than a political system, and it kind of obviates the need for nation state localized government, because all of that has just been sidestepped within one global technocratic digitized system, one currency, the whole thing really that we see potentially being rolled out now. Transhumanism is probably the latest iteration, I say, of this sort of thinking, and it's got its obvious leading exponents within Silicon Valley and the Ray Kurzweils of this world and the rest of it, and there's a lot of material online around it. And essentially the vision for the transhumanists is that we are destined to kind of move from a purely biological basis into this kind of techno-biological sort of hybridization. I think it's propelled by some extremely narcissistic, egoic ideas around conquering immortality, and which couldn't be a more sort of egoic, narcissistic sort of goal. And I think it's, as an agenda, it's probably much more implemented than many of us would like to believe, and that if we actually looked at ourselves under electron microscopes, we would find that we're all full of all sorts of nanofibers and all sorts of things which we're probably unaware of. But I suppose my concern about the transhumanist agenda is, well, and I'm sure many people ascribe to it and believe in that, and there's nothing, and that's fine. I personally don't really relish the idea of becoming sort of part cyborg. It's not really on my agenda. What I find, what is concerning about it is that we're not given any choice, and that it's applicable to all of us. But also, again, it's this notion that life and even consciousness, complex biological systems, can be reduced to very binary computer code. It's essentially trying to take complex systems and turn them into complicated systems. And again, that's a bit of sort of systems thinking, but a complex, there's a difference between a complex biological system and a complicated system. A complex system has all sorts of emergent properties. A forest is a complex system. If the forest burns down, it will regenerate. But when you cut down a forest and take the timber and build a house, you've created a complicated system. And when the house burns down, it doesn't rebuild itself. So there is this constant linear progression of taking self-regulating, regenerating complex systems and turning them into very much more simplistic linear and binary systems. And I suppose, just as an aside on that note, I think it's very interesting. John Lilly, who is famous for creating the flotation tank and did these sort of heroic, extraordinary journeys on huge quantities of LSD and ketamine, and was trying to communicate with other species, etc., and was an incredibly gifted scientist. But one of his sort of insights towards the end of his life was he felt that there was a technological force at work in the universe that was intent on subsuming all biological life into what he called the technium. And I think if we take this very sort of meta view of the momentum within technological systems, one can see how that's appropriate. And I think we'll go into this more deeply over the coming weeks and months, but I think our attitude to science and technology is absolutely critical here. And it's very easy for anybody who raises questions around technology is immediately branded a Luddite, or that they're just sort of, trying to take us back to the Stone Age. But it's not that. It's just that actually an unbridled acceptance that all technology is progressive and positive, rather than having any kind of scrutiny and public debate about how we want to relate to these technologies and which technologies we actually want to integrate into our society. We're just not having those conversations, and it again falls into these very sort of binary black and white divisions. So, for instance, vaccination. I don't think the people who are branded anti-vax are necessarily anti-vax per se, but they're just raising questions about certain vaccinations which haven't been proved necessarily to be safe and effective. So these are very nuanced, complex arguments, and we tend to, because we're caught in this very polarized, dualistic way of looking at everything. And I'd say this is probably the one thing that we need to transcend as a species at the moment, and we'll get to that in more detail at the end of this video. But we're bounced from these black and white polarities typified in our sort of two-party sort of political spectrum. And if you're raising any questions about science and technology, you're a Luddite. You're raising any questions around capitalism, you're a communist. It's incredibly naive, and it completely dispels any possibility for really nuanced discussion around these issues. So following on from that, I just wanted to talk a little bit about what people are calling sense-making, making sense. And of course, this is incredibly pertinent now. Again, while we're all struggling to make sense of what's going on, we're victims of sort of algorithmically weaponized social media, of mainstream media clearly co-opted by political and corporate lobbying and interests. Something like 80% of the advertising revenue for the 5 mainstream media companies in the US comes from big pharma. So it's very easy to see how these agendas can be played out. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about this term conspiracy theory, because again, anybody who's deemed to be raising flags or picking holes in the official narrative is a conspiracy theorist. Well, conspiracy theory was a very clever term concocted by the CIA, I think, to do precisely this, to demonize or ridicule anybody who deviates from the official story or the official narrative. Oh, you dispute the official story of events around the JFK assassination, you're a conspiracy theorist. Well, the problem is, and I've been in this arena for 25, 30 years, what I have noticed is that over the progress of time, the things that I, 25 years ago, dismissed as conspiracy theory have increasingly, gradually over time, become increasingly validated. Now, I don't know where this process stops, and I'm not suggesting, that I buy into some of the more extreme conspiracy theories that are out there, but I think we have to just look at the events of the last 100 years to see how many of the sort of really epoch-shifting events have over time been revealed through whistleblowers and declassified documents to have been precipitated by what was previously seen to be a conspiracy. Now, whether that's been the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which was a sort of false flag that brought the US into the Vietnam War, the fact that Roosevelt had prior warning of the Pearl Harbor attacks but let them go ahead because, again, it gave the excuse for the US to go to war. So, again, I think it's an incredibly complex and loaded term, but we do need to be careful about where we use it and where we actually decouple the word theory from conspiracy, because an awful lot of things that are deemed to be conspiracy theory these days, I would say, are considerably more validated as conspiracy fact than the official narrative that they are supposed to be contrary to. So I think our ability to actually find credible sources and drill down into what's really going on is very, very complicated. And the reaction, either we want to just sort of throw our hands in the air and have nothing to do with it, or we disappear down rabbit holes that may well get driven by sort of algorithmic bias and our own internal kind of bias. And it's very easy to see how we get into these increasingly atomized and sort of fragmented and rather divisive kind of places. But I suppose just on that note, I think there are a few things to really be aware of. There's this whole business around fact-checking now, but who's fact-checking the fact-checkers? And lots of people have done some quite detailed analysis of this online, and you can see that a lot of the fact-checkers that a lot of people are going to now as the great sources of truth are funded by all sorts of the usual suspects. I think we have to really look at who's funding the science, the scientific papers, what are the vested interests at work behind validating a particular view of things. And Charles Eisenstein, I'm sure many of you know, who I see as one of the most important voices in the world right now, he put it absolutely beautifully in a talk the other day where he talked about institutionalized confirmation bias and paradigm protection. So within this reductionist scientism community, as time goes by, these very specialized fields of research are dependent for funding on particular avenues. So if you actually wanted to research something that's completely out of the box, you're just simply not going to get the funding, you're not going to get the position. So good luck to you. So as time goes by, this confirmation bias and protection of the scientific paradigm becomes ever more inculcated, and those that deviate from it are ever more sidelined and dismissed as pseudoscientists, conspiracy theorists, quacks. And for sure, a lot of the people and technologies and initiatives and scientists that I would like to draw attention to over the coming weeks and months, I'm no doubt that if you look them up on Wikipedia, they will be described with one of those epithets. And it's actually incredibly hard for someone, Rupert Sheldrake, a biologist who I have tremendous admiration for and who's written countless scientific papers, one of the brightest biologists of his generation, but is still dismissed as a pseudoscientist on Wikipedia for precisely this reason. So I think we just have to be very, very careful about where we choose to get our information. We have to dig deep, if we really got the energy to do so, to really find impartial, unprejudiced points of view around these issues, because it's increasingly contaminated, that whole space, by these sorts of factors. And then one other area I just wanted to touch on is what one might call the theory of change. And Colin Tudge, this fantastic writer around agroecological farming, who I've spoken to in the past, and I'm going to be speaking to again soon, and has a fabulous new book coming out. And he articulates it very beautifully with three different words: reform, revolution, and renaissance. And I think it's just very, very pertinent right now, because yes, we can continue to try and reform existing systems and institutions and processes to make them a little bit better than they were before. But if they're intrinsically predicated on core principles that are out of step with where we want to be, all they can ever be is incremental optimizations to a broken system. So what are the alternatives? Revolution, I suppose, as a word, always seems to conjure up violent, chaotic, anarchic kind of disruption. And I'm not saying it's not an important part of this process. And I think that protest and taking to the streets, and as Martin Luther King said, dissent without civil disobedience is consent. It's very, very important. But also looked at historically, revolutions have often not really achieved what they set out to do. They may have created a disruptive event, but that which came after has not necessarily been a step change improvement on that which came before. And that's why I love this word renaissance, which I think speaks much more to genuine systemic change. And this classic Buckminster Fuller quote that's been my sort of guiding star for 20 plus years and is now being bandied around a lot, that you cannot create change by fighting the existing reality. You have to build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. And I think this is how scientific paradigms change, when the weight of empirical evidence becomes so great that the conventional mainstream perspective has to shift to incorporate that. This is how tremendous societal change comes about. And this is why I think it's an incredibly important thing for us to really take on board now in terms of genuine systemic change and trying to create regenerative culture. And what I hope we're highlighting and pointing to on this platform is our mechanisms and processes and initiatives which enable us from the ground up in this distributed model to actually implement and effect genuine systemic change. Because I do not believe it's really possible to actually reform many of the current institutions and systems and processes in the way that we need to. And that by focusing on trying to reform these top-down policies and decisions and institutions, we are taking on an almost insurmountable task. I'm not saying that people shouldn't do it, and if people are in a position in the corridors of power to affect change, or in positions of power within the hierarchies of big corporations, then of course they must do it. But for the vast majority of us, these things are just simply untenable. They're just out of our reach. And yes, we should write to MPs and protest and all of these things. But in a way, I'd say the most powerful and effective things we can all be doing are actually physical, tangible implementation of some of the things that we're trying to highlight on these platforms, on this platform, because it brings us together as families, as communities, or even within a business, into real-time analog activities where either through a community-supported agriculture scheme or through some sort of local alternative currency or through alternative upstream healthcare, through harvesting rainwater, through micro energy grids, we actually not only come together, build strong reciprocal bonds and sort of regenerative hubs into our core communities. And of course, we have to find those that are resonant with this stuff. Not everybody is, and that I really believe is fundamental to this. Wherever we are, even in a restricted urban environment, if you can find at least two other neighbours in your close vicinity who resonate with this sort of stuff, as soon as you've got, I'd say, a core group of 3 people, the emergent properties that come out of that immediately make so much more possible than operating on your own, or even as two people. There's something about the power of at least three people that coming together and extrapolating from that really this is how we can also build a new parallel system, safety net within the collapsing shell of the old. And those communities that have got the greatest power over their food, their water, their health, all of these things, are by logical definition going to be those that fare the best should these fragile supply lines and centralized infrastructure and all of this stuff start to fail us. And that is why I think that this is so incredibly important now, and is so incredibly empowering, and gives us meaning and gives us purpose, and it brings us, it makes us reconnected with each other, reconnected with the natural world. It gets us away from the digital landscape and being totally sucked into our screens. And I'm not saying we throw away our computers and the rest of it, not at all, but we need to balance and harmonize these things. We need to be informed and inspired by the digital space so that we can then go out and proactively inject that into our communities in whichever way seems appropriate or most accessible for us to do so. I remember when I was a kid growing up, there was a program on television that was actually called Don't Watch Television, Why Don't You Do Something Useful Instead? And ironically, it was a television program suggesting all sorts of other analog activities. So I find myself in a rather similar position now, where I'm obviously using the digital medium to try and encourage people to separate themselves from the digital space as much as possible, to go and engage with these sorts of activities. But again, it's back to this: I'm not anti-technology, I'm not anti-science, far from it. But it's about the wise and intelligent use. Fritz Schumacher, who wrote this beautiful book, Small is Beautiful, in the early 70s, which was one of the sort of seminal books for the environmental movement. And he made this absolutely crucial distinction between technology that was just clever and technology that was wise and intelligent. And I think we can look at, there are lots of technologies that might seem to be very clever, like genetic modification and nuclear power, but under further scrutiny, are they really wise and intelligent given the potential fallout? Likewise, obviously, the possibilities that this incredible digital connection that we now have globally, the power that this has to bring us together around these issues is inestimable. However, if we spend 90% of our waking time disappearing down rabbit holes online or just watching movies, and yes, we can get incredibly informed, we can be entertained, and we can be digitally connected. But there's increasing amount of evidence that this comes at the expense of our real human connection and the real evidence out there that just actually being in nature, just literally just walking barefoot in nature or going into the woods, biologically proven now to be good for our sense of well-being and our sense of connection and our physical and mental health. So I guess, like everything, it's a bit of balance, and recognizing that we use these technologies in the most sort of pertinent and effective way, rather than letting ourselves be run by them. And I have a visual tool which I think is potentially a very effective way of mapping a lot of these transitions that I'm talking about here. I feel we are engaged in a paradigm shift, or even a shift in consciousness. And these are very kind of nebulous terms. So I wanted to really sort of ground that into this visual model, what I just call the loo roll analogy. And essentially, if you look at this in 2 dimensions like this, it looks like a rectangle if that was just drawn on a page. However, as soon as I shift it into 3 dimensions, you can see it's not a rectangle, you can see that it's a cylinder. Now, the basic point here is, and I'm not sure if some of you are probably aware of Ken Wilber, the transpersonal psychologist, but one of the great takeaways I'd say from Wilber's work is that one of the defining features of successful evolution is the integration and transcendence of that which came before. So the way that is articulated here is, in this space, the two dimensions of the rectangles, and it has been integrated and transcended into that. So when something is seen from this perspective, it can see that it was a rectangle from over there. But when seen through the lens of just this two-dimensional space, it's got no inkling of the three-dimensional space that lies beyond it. So, for instance, the reductionist, materialist scientism paradigm that I talk about often, to my mind, is caught within this very two-dimensional, linear and polarizing framework, whereas the sort of systems biology, new biology, or some of the new sciences, or these insights we have around epigenetics, neuroplasticity, the microbiome, ecological thinking, these have integrated and transcended the limitations of the reductionist paradigm. They see that those things remain true when seen through that lens, but they've also seen that there's something much more complex or much greater that lies beyond. But while we remain stuck only looking at things through this lens, we're obviously limiting ourselves, and we are incapable of seeing and integrating the genuine systemic change that we need to move towards. So, for example, I would say that this represents polarization, a linear extractive economy, the limits of reductionism. This represents the true systemic understanding that the new biology shows us. This integrates, this shows us circular economics, which internalizes those things that are currently externalized, like the health of the biosphere and human society. Again, looking at human health or topsoil health, this is the vision that thinks that once you've depleted the topsoil of the 84 trace minerals that it had, if you just bung a whole load of synthetic phosphorus, potassium and nitrogen there, you're going to recreate the problem, which of course is woefully inadequate. This is the vision that thinks that it can treat a complex systemic biological illness with a non-biological synthetic agent, whereas this recognizes that actually to recorrect gut health in the microbiome is a much more complex process than the delivery of one pill, even one probiotic pill, and we'll be going into this much more deeply in the health section. So I often will refer to this, I find it will probably over the coming weeks and months, as a way to potentially articulate this transition in scientific paradigms, this transition also in our understanding of who and what we are, and in a way of trying to break out of this very kind of ego-identified consciousness framework that we're limiting ourselves to. Another way of applying this would be, and again, this is often a very simplified thing, but it's just a model, the left-right brain hypothesis. And again, I find this very useful at the moment. The left brain is this very masculine, analytical, rational part of us that has become the predominant underpinning of our culture, particularly in the last 200 years, and is the underpinning of the sort of reductionist science that I feel is also limiting us and keeping us out of step with biological systems. Whereas this is this more right-brained feminine side that is more comfortable with uncertainty, and it's more looking at context. It's looking at the whole system rather than just breaking things down into its component parts. And in a way, it's this vision of the right-brained sort of balance is much closer seemingly to how many indigenous cultures have lived, symbiotic relationship with their environment, whereas this is this very sort of rigid and inculcated mindset that I believe we're being invited to transcend now, if we're going to have any hope of getting out of the pickle that we've created for ourselves because of this particular way of looking at the world. So thank you very much for listening to this, and do refer back to this video further down the line if you think it's helpful in terms of understanding some of the other things we're going more deeply into. It's meant to be a sort of primer stroke sort of glossary for what's coming over the future weeks and months. And do please obviously share with anybody else you think this is resonant with, and please give us your feedback. Let us know what you feel is relevant, what you feel needs to be unpacked a bit more, and it needs to be explained a bit better. And I really look forward to going on this journey with you. Thank you so much.